Welcome back to Business Daily here on Trust TV. Now, the weekend was rife, actually Sunday was rife with the news of our former president, the death of our former president, Muhammadu Buhari. He passed away at age 82 in a clinic in London. Of course, he had to bring his body back and all the burial rites that will be done, but may his soul rest in peace. Now, the program this morning, and I know that my colleague yesterday did some sort of recap on certain sectors that he looked into. But this morning, we're beginning to just go in and zoning into that to look at his policies, his economic legacy, actually. What did President Muhammadu Buhari, his time, his economic policies, its impact on us as a country? Are we still feeling that impact? Are we still reeling from it? That's what we're looking at this morning on the program. And now to further have this conversation with me is Faiz Mohammed, is an economic and public affairs analyst here in the studio. And joining us via Zoom from Kano is Dr. Emmanuel Bashayi. He's equally a business and economic analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Thank you for having us.
I'm sure that I want to believe. Look, I'm not saying I'm sure, but I want to believe you were saddened by the news of the death of our president, a former president rather, on Sunday.
Well, if I'm being honest, I feel that the late president lived a full life. 82 years is not a short lifespan, and he has achieved a lot more than most of us will be able to do in that time span. So I saw it as a time for passing.
Okay.
Not necessarily a sad occasion, but a closed chapter.
A closed chapter. I was going to say there's so many people at that time frame, that same people in that area. Some of them are still alive. So I wouldn't say a generation has passed, because some people are still
passing.
there. Yeah, but they're still around. Let's go back to the conversation. Now, we know some of the things that the president did. I'm going to give a timeline. Earlier, some clips came up on your screen. So we're going to go to 2015. When he first came into power. Now we can see that in 2015, he was sworn as president on May 29. We know that already. Oil prices crash, FX revenue drops, and then introduction of Treasury single account, CSE to centralized government funds. The CBN imposes FX restrictions on 41 import items to conserve foreign reserves. We know the impact. Actually, let's just look at that. That last one, the impact of that FX restrictions on 41 import items, we really felt that, in some people's businesses had an impact because of what could happen there.
That's true.
Now, in 2016, there was an economic. Now, under President Buhari, in case you're not aware, we had two recessions. 2016 was the first one. Economic recession triggered by low oil prices and FX crisis. Now, the president launched social investment programs, Empower, conditional cash transfers, school feeding, trader money. We'll pause there a bit, and let me now go back a bit to some of the things that he did. I'm going to read out some things now. Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, ERGP, that was from 2017 to 2020. We'll see that in subsequent times, and that was aimed at diversification, agriculture, solid minerals, manufacturing. And this was actually aimed at pulling us out of the recession, stabilizing the macroeconomy, improving infrastructure, especially power and transport, promoting private investment. Now, what was the outcome of that? It helped end the 2016 recession, but growth remained sluggish. Now, foreign exchange, FX controls on multiple exchange rates, introduced capital controls and operated multiple exchange rates through the Central Bank of Nigeria. It aimed to defend the naira and reduce forex demand. Now, it created distortions, apparently encouraged round tripping and discouraged foreign investment, eventually led to a backlog in FX access for businesses. Now, we come to the one that was a very big deal in his regime, which was agricultural and industrial policies, the Anchor Borrowers Program, CBN-backed loan scheme for smallholder farmers. It boosted rice production, but suffered from repayment issues and limited transparency. We're still having some people talk about that whole Anchor Borrowers Program till now. This is some funny stories around it up until this moment. Now, import substitution push. banned 41 items from accessing FX, which is rice, tomato paste. And this was majorly done to help the rice production in Nigeria. But of course, you see what that Anchor Borrowers program was supposed to help with. And then, of course, encourage local production, but raise costs of manufacturers. Now, of course, social investment. Now, capital projects. Under his regime, we saw the railway come back to life. Now, for most people who go to Abuja, Kaduna, the rail is an option. That's one thing. Have taken the rail from Warri to Itakpe, and it was actually a very good ride. So we see the rail, heavy spending was on railroads and bridges, power sector interventions. Now, it was often financed through Chinese loans and bonds, including Euro bonds. Now, borrowing and debt policy. Public debt rose from 12.1 trillion naira in 2015 to over 46. That is times 3, almost times 4 by 2023. By the time time for him to leave. Now, debt servicing became a major concern, consuming over 90% of federal revenue at one point. And we need to think that trend started under his regime. Is that so? The trend of having more of our budget servicing debt, or rather our revenue servicing debt.
Yes, that was a result of 2 recessions back to back, really. When the government decided back then to restrict the import on 41 items, the idea was to help boost local production. The thought was that with less of these items coming in, local produce would then have a foothold and increase the amount of production that we have within Nigerian borders. However, that was met with very mixed results. The crash of oil prices in 2016 did not help our finances, and while we were able to get out of that relatively quickly, considering the dearth of financial backing that we had, we were very quickly then thrown into another recession due to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. It really left the government very little in terms of options. When it came to external borrowing, the reality was that during the years of the pandemic, most of the funding from external partners would go into health financing. Therefore, the government needed to get creative, and the Ways and Means mechanism was really one of the options that the government had to finance most of its programs. This led to a high debt profile. It led to a consistent borrowing scheme that we are still really trying to pay back in certain aspects. But I do think that considering the situation at the time, the government had very little options, and it did the best it could with the limited options it had available.
Okay, so Dr. Emmanuel Bashi, I believe you're still there, and you've heard me reel out some information and some numbers. But what's your take generally from some of this information that I've reeled out this morning about the economic policies of President Buhari? There's still some, maybe as the program progresses, we'll still talk about some of them.
It's also about your policy prescription, number of things. So what we saw was that it took the government, when he came in 2015, a long time to assemble a cabinet, the economic advisory team, and so on and so forth. And government, I mean, the nature abhors a vacuum. So when there's a transition from one government to another, and you don't have the right full setup of the full complement of the team, you likely run into those kind of issues, which was all had. And just a year down the line, we went into a recession, and that was majorly driven by such policy prescriptions. So while we will be tempted to focus on the negatives, there are, of course, definitely positives. The second Niger bridge came on stream during the time of Buhari. You mentioned the railway. Definitely, you have to give him those flowers. Warri, Itakpe, Abuja, Kaduna, and then I think work had already started on some of the Daura, into Niger lines and all, right, just to facilitate that regional trade. So while there were a lot of things to be desired in terms of the policy prescriptions, it's also important to note that there were some that worked quite well, and we have to give him that credit for it.
Okay, so let's head back to our timeline. Let's follow this as he came into power till he left. So 2015, oil prices crash, FX revenues drop, TSA to centralized government funds, and then imposing of the FX restrictions on 41 import items to conserve foreign reserves. Let's look at these issues now. Was that an ideal move when he came into power in 2015? Faiz?
The concessions themselves?
Let's look at the TSA, really. Did that help in any way? Because it's supposed to centralize government funds.
Well, the idea of the TSA was not simply to centralize government revenue, but also to really combat corruption.
Yes.
To ensure that government funds, and both external or internal, were being used effectively. I think to a certain extent, it did allow for better tracking. It did allow for the government to ensure a certain level of control over the direction of the nation's finances. The question is whether or not the direction that they took really helped the economic output of the nation. And I think there have been mixed results in that section.
All right, Dr. Bashe, what's your take on the things that happened in 2015?
The things that happened in 2015, Fayez had mentioned the TSA. It created a lot of bureaucracy in the system. We also had the restrictions on FX. Now, I tell you, it didn't just impact on the banned items, the items on the banned list. It also impacted on even personal issues. So before then, if you traveled abroad, you could use your Naira debit card and withdraw cash from an ATM. But after that policy, you couldn't do that. So personal travels were impacted. I remember just prior to that period, I was in Kenya, and as soon as I arrived at the airport, I used my debit card to withdraw Kenyan shillings. But you couldn't do that after that policy. People needed to pay for stuff online. They couldn't do it because our Naira cards could no longer work. Importers now had a nightmare trying to source for FX. So the black market became the place to go, and then that exacerbated the pressure on the system. So while we're trying to solve one problem, we created a new problem. And that problem was significantly exacerbated or significantly exaggerated because we're an import-dependent country. So while we need money, we need foreign exchange to be able to get our transactions completed. We now had inflation take a toll, because when the importer gets FX at a high rate, it's going to transfer that cost to the consumer. So that also impacted on consumer purchasing and the cost at which we get what we buy. It was in Buhari's time that even the market woman selling okra started knowing about dollar. And she's like, oh, dollar this, dollar that. Some people don't even know the color of the US dollar. But everybody was now hiding under the guise of it, and then things. That was the downward spiral of many, many more things. And to be honest, while the policies were good in themselves, the execution was not as fantastic as policy. I tell you this, you wanted to ban the importation of these products, but we didn't have a significantly high capacity to produce those things locally. So you want to remove a plug, and you know that that plug will create a ripple in the system. So what did we do to improve our local capacity for those items before we removed the plug? We didn't quite do that. So there was pretty much of a rash decision. Let's just do it, we'll figure it out as we go. There was no end-to-end thinking about those things before we did that. And that created the pressure we had on the US dollar as we went. And then with the different windows between the parallel market and the official window, then created another room for people to cash in. So somebody gets dollars from the CBN and then walks into zone 4 in Abuja, and he's a millionaire the next second. Because if he has friends in that space and he can get US dollars at the official rate, the difference was quite significant. So all of these things were things that created like a policy somersault, that while the intentions were genuine and good, the execution was not as fantastic.
All right, we're going to go on a very short break, and when we return, the program continues. To stay with us, please. Thank you for staying with us on Business Daily. Still discussing, analyzing President Buhari's economic legacy or policies, as the case may be. Now we're looking at 2015. What happened there, the TSA and all that. Let's move down a bit to 2016. Where some of these social intervention programs or investment programs came on board. Now we had an economic recession. The first one started then in 2016, and the NPAR, conditional cash transfers, school feeding, trader money. I'll start with you, Dr. Bashi. Do you think that these interventions actually had an impact, and did it reach the people it ought to reach?
So it will also depend on what were the targets that were set for those particular interventions. For me, when you don't have a destination in mind, you typically wouldn't know when you arrive. So that was my only challenge with it. What was the number of people we targeted to get out of poverty? Even if there was such a target, it wasn't a very public information. It wasn't top of mind for many people. We also had, I knew a lot of people who were part of the Empower program that created some economic stimulation. The trader money, of course, got directly to traders and could impacted directly on their businesses. and so on and so forth. So there were good programs and good initiatives, I must say, even though we had some bit of challenges with here and there with regards to how they were implemented, but very good intentions. There were two of them that I had problems with. The first was the school feeding program. I felt the school feeding program wasn't an intervention that the education sector needed. Our biggest problem in education in Nigeria today is not enrollment. So if you're feeding children because you want to boost enrollment, you're giving Panadol for the wrong sickness. So I felt the education sector needed something more structural, more sustainable, rather than just feeding children. That was one. The second is the conditional cash transfer. I felt it was just creating a conduit for corruption, where people just created a system where the system was created to just fund some of the political whims and caprices of some people who had access to those. Because for the most of the people that I know that benefited from it were people that had some political affiliations. So people who didn't have political affiliations didn't benefit, and that defeated the aim. I felt that money should have been more channeled towards the real sector, people that could invest in businesses, people that can be able to be supported to be able to grow their businesses and then be able to employ more people. That way we can further stimulate the economy better, and we can move further as a nation. So while those policies were good in themselves, they created some bit of stimulation to the economy. Remember, we were in a recession at the time. So by the time we came out of a recession, it was us growing against a lower base. So it wasn't like we were back to where we used to be. It is just like you failed last year, so your base is low, and now you're growing versus a low base, even though you are not even up to your previous peak. But then you are celebrating as if you did something so well. So we were coming from a low base, and then when we came out of the recession at some later on, it was looking like it was a celebration. But those interventions were good. The executions have a lot to be desired, but then we cannot completely say that those were the reasons why we went out of a recession.
All right. Over to you, Faiz. Do you agree with Dr. Bashai?
Well, to a certain extent, yes, Emmanuel is right. The truth is that while these programs did provide short-term relief and political goodwill, they did not provide what the government was looking for long-term, which is long-term employment. That requires private sector growth and not government-driven palliatives. What happens when you have these sort of programs is that they're short-term. So once the program ends, those people who had gained short-term employment fall off the index because they're no longer within the catchment area. So I think the programs in of themselves did serve to create a sort of safety net for a lot of people, because I do think that, at least in my experience, there have been several people who benefited from the Empower scheme or the trader money. In my experience, I can name a couple of hundred people, in fact, who I knew that benefited from that program on a consistent basis. However, once the program ended, they were back to where they were again, which meant that we had higher employment figures than we did during that particular time when the program was in effect. Generally speaking, I think while these social investment programs were well-intentioned, they did not have the necessary transparency and structure needed for long-term sustainable growth.
All right. So let's go to the next 2 years. We're going to have to lump them together because of time. So 2017, 2018, what happened over there? We see that the government wrote down the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, ERGP. The focus was for diversification, infrastructure, macroeconomic stability. Now, economic exits recession by Q2 of 2017. The Anchor Borrowers Program, ABP, expands nationwide to boost local farming. Now, in 2018, infrastructure push intensifies the rail projects, Lagos, Ibadan, Abuja, Kaduna, there were ongoing power sector interventions and road projects, ease of doing business reforms, gained traction under PEBEC, and FX policy remains heavily controlled despite pressure from investors. Now, what do you think the economic recovery and growth plan, how would you rate the overall success of that?
Well, the ERGP focused on a couple of sectors: agriculture, mining, manufacturing. And while I would say that there were modest gains in the agricultural sector, with rice production and poultry farming, structural inconsistencies and weaknesses, such as poor access to credit facilities, infrastructure challenges, and of course, very poor security, really hindered the growth of these programs to a sustainable degree. I would also say that the ERGP, while it had a concrete vision for what it is wanted to achieve, there was no local capacity built in order to achieve some of these ambitions. When you look at the manufacturing industry, for example, we lack sufficient local capacity to produce a lot of the items that we import on a large basis. And this is not something that the plan seemed to take into effect. It also did not do much for local mining. It's one of the areas in which Nigeria is still not doing very well. I think overall, while the ERGP was useful in seeing us through a recessive period, it lacked the overall transparency and cohesive structure, and of course the partnership with the private sector that is needed for long-term sustainable growth.
Okay, Dr. Bashayi, what's your take on that? Those 2 years, the things that happened there. What's your take on them?
So I think, in all transparency and honesty, we had the ERGP more like something on paper, and the details of how we were going to achieve that strategy was quite shrouded a whole lot of the time. And that's why we had a lot of tactical moves, very, very tactical moves. We had everything everything at that time seemed to have been like a fire brigade stuff. We needed something more strategic. Yes, the ARGP was meant to create that strategy, but pretty much a lot was going on in different pockets that made it look very, very haphazard, as I may say. I mean, with all humility and with all due respect. So for me, we had the ERGP. It addressed a number of things. One thing that we must say very clearly was that agriculture got a huge boost. Local production of especially rice and some staples was significantly supported and all. We were able to, I mean, before then, it didn't feel like Nigerian produced rice was a thing. We were able to get a lot of gains from there, and both farmers and consumers were significantly included in that plan. So it was a mix of many things. We wanted something more long term, but a lot of things were happening more tactical than strategic. That's my opinion, my honest assessment of that period.
Now we see that in that time frame, the ERGP, the plan was to diversify things. Now, do you think that under the Buhari's economy, we were able to actually diversify the economy away from oil? Faiz is laughing. Maybe
we made some progress.
I should go to Faiz because he's laughing. Or we'll come back to you, Doctor.
I think, very simply put, towards the tail end of the late president's tenure, oil accounted for 80% of Nigeria's exports and 50% of government revenue, which in itself makes any notions of economic diversification due to the plan highly questionable.
Okay, so Faiz has said what he said with a smirk. Dr. Bashayi, do you agree with him?
So the truth there is, when you're not pinched by something, it's difficult to leave the comfort zone. So what we still have is the fact that oil still accounts for the huge percentage of our foreign exchange earning. It's easy money. As long as you drill oil, you get money. So it wasn't we didn't have that level of push to want to do a whole lot more, which is why we will say something and we are in effect doing something else. All right. So when our revenues from oil dropped because of the global prices of oil dropping, while we were supposed to put more pressure on getting revenue from other sources, we went straight to go and borrow. So it wasn't, we were not taxing our brains on what can we do differently instead of borrowing. So it was an easy, they say following the path of least resistance is what makes rivers crooked. They don't go straight because they are looking for the easiest way around things, right? So for me, as long as we don't feel we still have oil coming out and bringing money, and we still have windows to borrow, it keeps us lazy and does not allow us to put the right level of weight in diversifying the economy in the most aggressive manner possible to ensure that we're able to create income sources apart from oil.
Okay. All right, let's move to the next 2 years. 2019, 2020, border closure was announced in August to curb smuggling and encourage local agriculture. Fuel subsidy continues despite rising cost, and unemployment and inflation remain high. Now we know what happened in 2020. It was a global situation. It was the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, oil prices collapsed, fiscal pressure worsens, emergency borrowing. From IMF, we took about $3.4 billion loan, and from them had Chinese loans. Now, of course, the government increase the stimulus programs, expand the programs, and then the recession returned briefly, especially in Q1 and Q3 of the year 2020. These are the things that happened in that time. First of all, let's start with the one that got a lot of people really, really riled up, and that is the border closure. What's your take? Was it a very, the reason and the impact, did it finally make sense? Did it come to some meeting point? The intention and then the impact?
So the intention really was to curb smuggling across the northern Nigerian border. But really, what it ended up doing was inflating prices, especially food prices. While farmers, especially rice farmers, benefited for some time, it really caused disruption in local markets, mainly because we did not have the growth and manufacturing capacity to replace the imports that were suddenly no longer available. But I also think it really undermined our relationship with our neighbors across West Africa. And it was also really telling that around the same time, the Africa Free Trade Agreement was coming into effect, ratified by 40 other countries across the continent. And Nigeria seemed to be nowhere to be found. Simply because at a time when the rest of the continent was opening its borders to try and integrate economic strengths, Nigeria was closing its borders. So the optics of at the time, the largest and most influential economy in the continent closing its borders and then still signing the Africa Free Trade Agreement was quite the paradox. And I think it really serves enough to say that the border closure was eventually lifted sometime in 2022 with very little gains to speak of at that point.
Dr. Bashari, what's your take?
So I think what we were thinking about ourselves was we felt we were the only people, we felt like the other African nations, our neighbors, were parasites and we were the ones that were feeding them. So we felt we were like the big brother that if we close the border, they suffer, we don't get to suffer and all of that. But that was not true. It was a symbiotic relationship. With borders closed, with borders open, it benefited both of us. I mean, there were things that we bring in from outside of Nigeria through the borders. There were also things that we used to take out. So while we were a bigger nation, we could take in more things. They also, I mean, there were also benefits that accrued to the fact that that open and that open way for both of us to transact benefited both of us. So just like Faiz had mentioned, it was like shooting ourselves to the foot, because while those other nations smaller, they could find alternative ways of doing certain things, we were stuck with very few options. So while the intention was good, it was not well thought through. Like, we didn't look at the different ramifications about what happens to all of us. There is something we call principle-based decision-making process. You look at who has the power to take the decision, but also look at who will be impacted by the outcome of that decision. So we got impacted because there were things we could move out of the borders more easily and export in small ways. We couldn't move them. So we were stuck with them, and those people could not bring their own things. And before you know it, they found other ways to survive. So today, even when we opened the border, they were like, you know what, we've moved on. So whatever benefit that accrued to us by doing trade with those people, we have lost it. We have allowed them to gain independence from us, and we cannot get that back again. Now, my problem was, if we did that border closure to curb smuggling, it's just like throwing the baby with the bathwater. You know there is a smuggling problem. Can you face the smuggling? What can you do differently to ensure that smuggling is curbed to the barest possible minimum?
Okay. All right. So we just have about.
You felt instead of addressing the smuggling, as it were, you decided to close the border. I mean, it was a paradox. Okay. You say one thing, you do a different thing, and that just doesn't add up.
Okay. Dr. Bashiri, we have just about 2 minutes, and though we still have 2021, 2022, 2023 to go through, I'm just going to rush through that, and you guys are going to give me your final words so that we could wrap up the program. Now, in 2021, rebound in oil prices helped, partially recovery, public debt reaches 3 trillion naira, introduction of e-naira, Africa's first central bank digital currency. Fuel subsidy remains despite mounting cost. Now again, 2022, fuel subsidy cost hits records high, consuming over 4 trillion naira. National grid collapses multiple times, sparking energy crisis concerns. Government postpones fuel subsidy removal amid public backlash. And of course, Buhari signs the 2022 Finance Act with new tax policies and incentives. And in 2023, he completes his second term. The debt is at 46 trillion naira, and 96% of the revenue was what was financing the debt. FX shortages, inflation, and poverty at record highs. So his legacy, in summation, included large infrastructure investments, mixed results on diversification, persistent macroeconomic instability. Now, let's wrap this up in less than 30 seconds for you, 30 seconds for Dr. Bashiri. In all, really, how well was the economic policies or legacy of President Muhammadu Buhari?
I think while his administration laid some groundwork and some good policies, especially in terms of transport infrastructure, it was marked by policy rigidity and the reluctance of the administration to really go through with some tough structural reforms and really arrest the security situation, left the economy with more challenges for its successors to have to handle. While the administration had great ambition, it was constrained by poor execution.
All right. Dr. Bashiri, your last words, 30 seconds.
So, in terms of overall rating, there were progresses that were made in certain areas. In terms of infrastructure, we'll talk about some of the legacy projects like the second Niger Bridge, the railway in Lagos, Itakpe, and Abuja. We also saw some other major highways in the country that were constructed or reconstructed within those periods. Coming to the economy, it wasn't a very fantastic one. It's mixed with a whole lot of things that made it difficult and made it a lot cloudy to say this was exactly what we could do. Security wasn't it at all. We have some of the highest levels of insecurity within this time and all. So it's just a combination of wins and losses that effectively leaves not a very good mark at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have to cut that short. Time is telling us we need to leave the studios. It's been quite a very interesting conversation this morning on the program, analyzing the late president's economic legacy and policies on Business Day this morning. I've had Faiz Mohammed, an economic analyst, and Dr. Bashai, an equal economic analyst, talking to us this morning on the program. That's the much we have for you today on Business Daily. For more of our programs, news and documentaries, do Wealth Plus on our social media platforms and our YouTube live stream. I've been your host this morning, Chiamaka Nwafo. Same time, same place tomorrow. Bye for now.